pleasure to welcome you all to the very first of our Dean's Fireside chat series in our launch year. We'll work on the fire part of it going forward. I don't know if I want to get to my conversation with James, but I also think it's useful before we get into that to just talk a little bit about what we're trying to do here at the Watson School in these series and kind of how it relates to today. So, this series and other events that we're hosting at Watson this year are designed to foster conversations on what we think are some of the world's most pressing policy challenges. And when we have visitors like James come to join us, it's just really incredible to be able to benefit from their experience working out in the world, dealing with these issues, bringing, really valuable perspective to what we're doing here at Watson that's critical towards the Watson mission of research teaching to create a just, peaceful, and prosperous world. Now, in this event, in other events, the point is to surface diverse perspectives, and you may hear a perspective that you disagree with. You may hear a perspective that you really, really disagree with, and that's okay. That's what we're after, and we're trying to understand disagreements and make progress on them as a critical part of moving the ball forward on these different policy issues. And I think as we go about that, we best make progress on disagreement by being respectful, curious, and gracious, right? Respectful of each other's differences, curious to understand more about what drives our divergent perspectives, and gracious in interpreting the intent of other people's comments. And so you may feel the need to protest, that's okay too. But your right to protest can't interfere with, the rest of everyone's right to participate in this discussion and learn about these different perspectives. And so, I'm really confident in our community that we have the capacity to hold these kind of difficult conversations, whether that's today about, what the federal government should be doing with respect to higher education, what's going on in the Department of Education, or in other events, of these series throughout the rest of the year. I also just like to remind everyone we are live streaming and recording this event, so keep that in mind as we go forward. With that, let me introduce James Kvaal. James is one of our nation's leading policymakers and experts on the role of higher education and the role of the government in higher education. He has a BA from Stanford and a law degree from Harvard. And really for the last 20 years and more, he's worked in and outside of the government around some of the most impactful policy discussions and changes as it affects higher education. So back at the beginning of the Obama administration, James was working in the White House and was really a key part of some of the expansions of Pell Grants and other education and workforce supports. He then served as deputy director of the Domestic Policy Council in the second half of the Obama administration, where again, he was involved in really some of the key efforts, whether it be the college scorecard or some of the efforts to help students that kind of hadn't been treated well through low quality for-profit degrees. He was the president of the Institute for College Access and Success, which is one of the leading organizations focusing on affordability, student debt, and making sure that college is a path towards economic mobility for all students. And over the past 4 years, he served as the Undersecretary for Education, which, in the structure of the Department of Education is really the top federal policymaker thinking about really all policies, programs, and other activities related to higher ed. And that includes a lot of the efforts in the last administration around loan forgiveness, the efforts around FAFSA reform, and we'll make sure to come to all of that. So please join me in giving James a great welcome to Brown. So I want to start this conversation by going back to 2022, 2023. So this is before the recent election, before DOGE. And I want to kind of set the scene of what you were seeing in the Department of Education at that time. Because I think, as we'll discuss, it's not that the pre-period was all full of, everyone completely happy with everything that the Department of Education was doing. So, just as you kind of step back in time, What do you think the Department of Education was doing really well in that time period? What do you think it was doing that it kind of struggled on? And how did you think about that as the undersecretary?
Yeah. Well, first, I'm really happy to be here. My brother met his wife here at Brown. I have two nibblings sitting front and center. So special place for me. And I'm very happy to be in conversation with you, John, who has produced really novel and groundbreaking research on higher education. And I've learned a lot from you. I think higher education policy before, the department was set up to make college affordable and improve access to higher education. And it had come a long way. We were providing about $130 billion a year in student aid, including loans. That's a quarter or a third of our total country spend on higher education. And some 40 million people had gotten a Pell Grant, including me, to pay for their college. And I think it's pretty clear a lot of people wouldn't be able to have gotten the educations they had gotten without the federal student aid. I think the struggle was the outcomes that we were getting from the higher education system was not always equal to our investment. And nationally, if you look at all colleges and universities, our graduation rate is about 60%. So that means whatever type of college or university you start at, 6 years later, you have a 6 in 10 chance of having any kind of degree. If that was in high school, we would call that a dropout factory. And in some cases, those degrees were not leading to the careers or the economic returns that students were seeking. And particularly problematic when you think about how prevalent student debt has become. So it's one thing to waste your time and not to get a degree, but that if you're also carrying debt, maybe you're worse off than if you had never gone to college at all. And so while colleges and universities possessed and still possess, perhaps unmatched potential to solve some of our country's problems around upward mobility and inequitable opportunity, we were not consistently delivering a positive investment for students.
And as you thought about trying to tackle those problems as you were in office this last time around, tell us what kind of policy approaches you were thinking about. And I'm interested both in the substance of the policy, but also in the process of trying to actually implement that policy, which is required in order to have whatever effect we're aiming for in the world.
Yeah. So, I think we, broadly speaking, had 4 areas of focus. And there were 2 where the department had a lot of ability to act on its own to make progress. The first being helping people with their student loans. And we determined that most people who are eligible for loan forgiveness because they were working in public service or they had a disability or they had been cheated by a for-profit college, most of them were not actually getting forgiveness through our system. They weren't able to navigate the bureaucracy, even when we knew they were eligible for forgiveness, but the law required them to apply. So we were able to do a lot, combining policy change and operational improvement, ended up forgiving 5 million loans. The second area is setting some kind of minimum quality threshold. And where there is a program or a school that leaves most of its students worse off, we withdrew that program's ability to offer
and just to
loans.
Clarify, so worse off means earning fewer dollars than they did before they went in?
Our measurement was called a debt to earnings ratio. So we looked at, for a typical graduate, how much did they owe and how much were they earning? And was that a reasonable estimate based on expert guidelines? And, we found that these places are able to improve. They can offer more scholarships. They can reduce the length of their program. And in those cases where programs couldn't improve, there typically were other programs in the same geography that had much better results. So the view was by cutting off sort of the lowest performing tail, you could improve the value that students got overall. The third area was trying to make more investments in higher education. And here you need the support of Congress, which President Biden had for 2 years. And we made big increases in Pell Grants. He tried to eliminate tuition at community college. And then the fourth area is trying to systemically improve student success rates. And I mentioned we have a 60% graduation rate. The good news is it's up 8 percentage points in the last decade. So we really have made a lot of progress as a country, identifying the things we need to do to help our students succeed. We have proven that the problem is not the students. It's not that most students aren't college material and we need to weed them out, because when we give them the right supports, they can master college level material. And so the question now is, how do we deploy those things that work to help many more students graduate and go on to a better life?
So one of, I think, the most prominent public areas where the department was trying to make progress while you were there was in the reform of the FAFSA system. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, can you just give people a sense of like what the system is, what you were trying to do, and then to preview some of the problems you ran into as you were trying to make those reforms?
Yeah, so I imagine some people in the room have some recent experience with the FAFSA. It has long been notorious as one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult, government form. And the evidence is not only is it a massive headache for 18 million people a year, but it's actually standing in the way of the student aid programs. We had something like 1 million students enrolled in college who are eligible for a Pell Grant, but hadn't completed the FAFSA. And if people actually on campus are not getting the Pell Grants that they're eligible for, then how many more students might be enrolled in college if they knew the actual price of college? So simplifying FAFSA is a good government thing. It makes all our lives easier, also makes student aid programs a lot more effective. In the last days of the first Trump administration, Congress passed legislation changing the formula and dictating how to simplify it. And, a good idea. As is often the case, I think people know the story when it came time to launch the FAFSA, which about 18 months ago, the form wasn't ready. And when it did launch, there were a lot of errors and bugs. It was not processing FAFSAs accurately until mid-April. So for many colleges that owed financial aid offers and students were trying to make decisions by the traditional deadline of May 1, the process couldn't work the way it was intended to. And that was, extremely frustrating for students and families, for college administrators who had to change all their calendars and enrollment was unpredictable. The reason for all those changes, I think government IT is very challenging in part because you have Congress, specifying at the front end exactly what the formula is and how this is going to work. There was no flexibility in the timeline. There was no money in the budget. And then the way the government IT process works, the next step is for the staff to lay out in excruciating detail exactly how this is going to work. So every single data element, how it moves through our 20 data systems, how it bounces off other agencies' data systems, that is written down in a schematic, and you use that to write the contracts for the 6 contractors managing these 20 different systems, plus the contractors managing the other agencies. You had to put it through, you had to write the form and put that through public comment. You have to write what's called the Statement of Records Notice, which is our public disclosure of how we use data in every data system. That goes through public comment. So you have this incredibly detailed plan written up front before any code is written. And that's the exact opposite of the way they do it in the private sector, where you start with a minimally viable project, and you start seeing if people like it and does it work and how do you build on it. So our plan was instead you sort of plug it all in at the end and hope it worked. It was compounded by the fact that it was a once in a career project. I mean, we were retiring computer systems that were almost as old as I am, that were written in COBOL, and doing something completely new, and lacked the expertise we needed in managing these contracts to adequately monitor the progress they were making. And so the result was not good. The good news is we did bring in a lot of outside expertise. We staffed up with the right kinds of people at FSA. We funded college outreach groups. And at the end of the day, we ended up with more people enrolled, more people getting student aid than had the previous year. So with the help of colleges and college outreach groups and high schools, we did manage to get people through the FAFSA and into college last year. And the FAFSA is now working well. It is easier. But I think it's also a lesson about how we need to improve government's ability to do these kinds of hard projects.
So let me follow up on that, because when you and I were in government together 12 years ago, that was when we had the Obamacare rollout, which of course, while it had its own specific set of issues, was at a high level a very similar kind of big new project in government that kind of eventually got to be okay, but certainly the rollout was very challenging. So this is not an isolated incident. And help me think through what parts of that would we want to improve by trying to be more like some of these private sector firms that seem to be able to roll out tech in a more effective way? And what parts of that would we specifically not want to copy the private sector, where there's specifically different objectives for what you and your colleagues are trying to do with, say, the FAFSA system, that will be different from a bank trying to roll out a new credit card processing system that's maybe dealing with a similar amount of dollars, a similar amount of kind of consumer volume, but is playing a very different role because it's in the private sector. It's not part of a public sector program.
Yeah, I mean, there's several differences. I mean, the government agencies have huge legacy IT systems that are decades old and are continuing to do their day jobs while we're trying to modernize them. So that's different from a lot of tech companies who are starting from scratch and using the most modern programming.
But just to be fair, right? I mean, I've not looked inside like Bank of America, but the notion of legacy tech systems, that is not something that is a government specialty. What is it about?
I mean, yes, there are some. On the other hand, canceling my account at Comcast is not easy either. So I think there are some problems with big organizations everywhere. I think the divided control over these processes is a problem. Congress writes it in great detail, but isn't responsible for the execution. There are lots of choke points within the executive branch. You have a office whose job it is just to examine student privacy. That's obviously a very important objective, but that office doesn't trade it off against anything else or consider the broader context. The department struggled to manage contractors. I think a lot of private sector best practice would be to bring that in-house and manage the development of those products themselves. The government, needs to serve everyone. And so, a lot of the challenges we had were, relatively small percentages of students in a very large and complex financial aid system. And, you have to launch it. It has to work for everyone. It has to work for everyone right away. A private sector company might say, okay, we're going to go for 80% of the market in the first year and then build on that. So there are a lot, I think it is very different.
And, if you were to go back and kind of get to rerun the last 4 years, taking all of that into account, what would you have done differently? Or, what would you, if you were writing a memo to someone thinking about the next government IT overhaul, what would you tell them?
I think we need more tech talent to be able to manage these contractors and not take them at their word, and to help co-create, products that meet all of our needs. And so, in retrospect, I wish we had staffed up and that we had insisted on more testing of the product, and that we had a team that was more qualified to ensure that we were on track. Because the progress reports we were getting, weren't borne out by ultimately what happened.
So let's fast forward to the current.
It's unfortunately, a lot of those people have been let go.
Well, that's right. So let's fast forward to the current moment, and I think that we've seen all across government, but Department of Education probably more than most, incredibly rapid changes in both the kind of organizational staffing dimension of what's going on and in some of the policies. Without, we can, dive into specific policies, but, even just at a higher level, what do you think has led to this particular moment, right? We've had, Republicans saying that they want to defund the Department of Education for at least 30 years. This is very different. We've had parties kind of sniping back and forth at each other about appropriate or inappropriate use of executive orders and other things like that for a long time. What do you think has led to this particular large shift?
Well, it's true. I mean, Republicans have been running on eliminating the Department of Education for probably since it was created in the 70s. And, it was created by Congress, and eliminating it would require an act of Congress. It hasn't happened because it's not a popular idea. Most people don't want to do it. I think what happened here is we saw an administration really willing to take legal shortcuts. Things that I would have thought were not permissible. So, it's one thing to say, we want to eliminate the department. We want to lay off all the staff and go to Congress and persuade Congress, to eliminate these programs over the course of a weekend, to lay off staff over the course of a weekend, people with civil service protections, that is very legally aggressive. And I would have said not permissible. Now, things are going through the courts, and, courts are allowing them to do some things I would have said were not permissible. But I think that willingness to really push the boundaries is the biggest difference. And then, we have a group of very ideological people in this administration who, are deeply skeptical of higher education. They also are going after other independent arbiters of truth and authority and scrutiny, law firms, late night hosts, what have you. And so I think it was a confluence between an effort to make some big changes on the bureaucracy, but the reason they picked the handful of agencies that they did is that it served their ideological agenda.
So let's take each of those in turn. And so I think you're right that this administration has been, pretty aggressive in terms of testing the legal boundaries of what they can do and they can't do. But, also if we think about the various measures that the Biden administration took to relieve student debt.
Totally different.
Right? Totally different. Tell me why it's different. So, these are, so let's just there were several different proposals thrown back by the courts 2 or 3 times.
Well, first of all,
yeah,
those of us
why is it different?
Those of us in the Biden administration believe we had an independent authority to follow the law, that it wasn't just a question of what a court would overturn, but we took an oath to faithfully execute the laws. Secondly, everything we did was grounded in the purpose and the text of the statute. So we never said, oh, we're president, Article 2, lets us do whatever we want. We were grounded in the statutory text and what the statute was trying to. 3, there was a process around that. So we talked to the career attorneys. On hard questions, we talked to the career attorneys at DOJ. We might confer with OMB or the White House. And that was not done to invent a rationale after the announcement had been made, that was a central part of the deliberative process. And moreover, whatever decisions we made were remediable. Student debt relief, the Supreme Court disagreed. That policy did not happen. And then, I also think the context matters. So if you're talking about individual cases of disagreement about the extent of the law on a particular priority of the president, that's very different than a widespread pattern of dubious initiatives. And particularly when those initiatives are targeting institutions like universities, news media, courts, the law. It's just it's a completely different situation, in my opinion. And I think that's really a weak excuse for them to paper over their actions.
So let's now come at this from the other perspective, which is, one part of this is that the Trump administration has taken all of these actions, affecting, as you noted, the Department of Ed staff and organization, higher education, institutions like Brown. But, you'd mentioned, you think that the support of eliminating the Department of Education doesn't, happen because it's actually not very popular. I have been struck by the lack of popular outrage defense around some of what the Trump administration has been doing around higher ed. And think what you want about, some people like it in the country, some people don't like it. But the one thing that definitely has not happened is a broad-based backlash of the sort. And we know this thing can happen, within 24 hours after the so-called Liberation Day tariffs at the beginning of April, there was a widespread oh my God, how could you possibly do this? And that was all reversed very, very quickly. And we've not seen, tell me if you disagree, but it does not seem like there's been a similar level of backlash to that. And why do you think that is?
Well, I do think the environment we're in is, incredibly noisy, incredibly chaotic. People are in their bubbles. And, in another time, a president accepting a $300 million plane from an oil state, that would be an incredibly salient thing that people would understand why that's problematic. Firing a prosecutor over unwillingness to bring charges, is on par with the biggest scandals of Watergate. And, these things seem to pass as just another week here. I think that, on top of that, there is an element of savvy in the targets he picks. And I think those of us who believe in the civil service, those of us who believe in universities, need to do a better job articulating what's at stake when those institutions are attacked, because it is unfair and very traumatic and damaging for the civil servants themselves. But the point is what they were doing to build a better country. We all have a stake in it. And, we don't give these research dollars to R1 universities, to enable them to have nice quads or whatever. We do it because there's a return for our country in having these kinds of places and the scientific and social progress that they drive. So we need to do a better job on our side, sort of communicating what's at stake and going back to the principles of why we make these investments in the first place.
But let me push you on that, because I feel like if you had asked me 12 months ago, what is going to draw more outrage, whether the tax rate, the tariff rate on imported goods from Vietnam is at 35% or 15%, or attempting to take away the nonprofit status of Harvard University, or refusing access of international students into the country, I would have said exactly for the reasons you mentioned, like, look, like whatever the tariff rate is coming from Vietnam, like that is not a super salient policy, even if it is economically important. Whereas some of these actions on universities, they have been really front and center in a lot of the news coverage, right? It's not like they're things nobody's paying attention to. And yet you got an order of magnitude more public backlash on the first and on the second. And you think it's just
on the tariffs.
Tariffs, yeah. You think that it's just different people responding? You think that it's, it feels to me like there's, like, yes, it's a noisy environment, but there's something deeper about, it's not just that we don't need a better, comms office to advertise what universities are doing to support the country. There's some deep lack of loss of faith, loss of trust in what some of these, especially more kind of selective elite higher education is. I mean, even like using the word elite has this very negative connotation in a way that it didn't, you could use elite and you're like, wow, like these are like the very best and the brightest in the way that has a good connotation. But I think it has a very negative valence when you talk about it in that way.
Yeah. Well, agree in large part. I mean, tariffs have the advantage of actually affecting people in their day-to-day life. And that's always going to be more salient when they're not reading about it in the paper or on, I don't know where people get their news nowadays.
Kind of, but I mean, the prices have not gone up a ton in tariffs, right? And they certainly didn't go up the day after the announcement. So
I promise they're not responding to an article in the Wall Street Journal about tariffs. They're like they're seeing prices in their daily life. That said, I do think higher education does need to take this seriously. And there's, a temptation, I think, to batten down the hatches and wait for the next election. And, I'm not suggesting that there's anything to be gained by negotiating with the Trump administration, but I do think it is worth reflecting on why the right-wing populist critique of universities does seem to resonate more broadly, and what we can do to make our case to the American people that these institutions are in all of our interests to have strong colleges and universities. I think the caricature of selective colleges and universities, they are too expensive for regular people. They have a different set of values that they teach our young people. We send them our best students and they never come back to our communities. So there are fundamental doubts about higher education's value and about its values that we need to reflect on, and we need to build deeper roots in the communities that we are asking for support.
And, is there, kind of coming back to the more organizational side of this, is there a silver lining in the willingness to be more fluid with the structures of the Department of Education to, move things, to move fast and break things as a way to drive policy reform of the sort that we were talking about before? Or is this something you think is kind of not really at the core of what's going on?
I don't know. I think there's a temptation to say, they have the right goal and the means are wrong. And you sort of see over and over again, maybe they really are worried about crime in Washington, D.C. or whatever. So I think you do need to pressure test those rationales. And if they were really serious about government efficiency, they would not have come in and over the course of a weekend, someone told them to fire half the staff. They fired 49.5% of the staff, got out. From what I have been told, they got out these blueprints and tried to pick the names of these different offices and divisions and figure out which ones were not mission critical. So, were there staff that could be let go? Yes. Was this in any way like a measured or thoughtful approach to shed low performers and build a more efficient system? It wasn't. I mean, they have from the people on the right that I talked to, they have a ideological, good faith view that the federal government should not be involved in education, by which they really mean K-12 education. And so you could, have an argument on the substance about whether that is meritorious or not. But I have not heard an objection to the student aid programs. So why are they laying off half the staff that run the student aid programs? It's to make the department smaller, to make it easier to eliminate it, to serve their K-12 goals. That's what they say to me.
And so, the type of thing that people have proposed, let's just think about the student aid programs, is, financial sector knows how to do this pretty well. We have different kind of independent agencies or outsourcing where let's contract out the Pell Grant program, the loans program to some set of firms in the private sector. We can set up I'm not sure if Fannie Mae is exactly the right analogy given the history there, but even just focusing on the substance there, what would you, how do you think about those more kind of less government, more market-oriented proposals to take seriously the issues of operation and for these programs?
I think it's half of the answer. We have for a long time made student loans without regard to students' or parents' ability to repay. And in some cases, very large loans. And for many students, that was okay. For me, loans were kind of a drag, but it didn't change my life trajectory. But there are a lot of people out there who are really struggling with their loans. Prior to the payment pause, we had 1 million people a year defaulting on their student loans. We have about 4 million people of any given age, if that's a way of calibrating just how many that is. And big racial disparities. Black students often 10 or 12 years after leaving school owed almost as much as they borrowed. So there are a lot of people out there who are really struggling with their loans. And so we need to think about how we pay for college differently. And if there are programs where students graduate and they get a job and they can repay their loan, maybe that's fair. I think you could have an argument about why we have debt at all. But in particular for those programs that are serving lots of low-income students, lots of students of color, who we know are more likely to borrow more, they're less likely to graduate, they're less likely to earn as much, then we need to think about different ways of paying for those loans. And if you are interested in the non-economic goals of higher education, if you want to support people studying religion or theater, the way to do that is not to give them a loan they won't be able to repay. So, I think there is some value in taking a look at the set of the student loans that we know students are very unlikely to be able to repay and say, we're not going to make those loans anymore. But it has to be accompanied by a conversation in how are we going to invest in our higher education system to serve the goals of upward mobility, serve the higher goals of our society, or else you're going to reduce all of higher education just to the financial ROI for students. And that's, I think, a really impoverished vision.
And are there, this is not an issue that the United States is alone in struggling, how to pay for higher education. Are there kind of models internationally? Have you seen other countries do things, set aside whether one can put something exactly over? Are there ideas, are there directions that you've seen internationally that might give us ideas on where to go, either on the upfront financing of higher ed, because somebody's got to pay for it, or on the ex post issue you mentioned, where for people to graduate with a given amount of debt, some people are going to end up earning a lot of money and paying that off. Other people are not going to earn a lot of money. Most of that variance has to do with career choice rather than how hard they're working. And so how do we make the repayment kind of fit the circumstance in a way?
Yeah. I mean, generally, other countries subsidize higher education much more than we do. to the extent there are loans, as you're suggesting, it tends to be a more narrow group. It would be more equivalent to, traditional full-time undergraduates at selective colleges. Whereas, we make a lot of loans to, single mothers in their late 20s going part-time to community college. Those folks aren't in debt in other countries. And then, they do tend to have repayment as a share of income, often as a default option. That's, an option in our programs as well. They tend to have a much higher income protection. So you really would be earning more like, I don't know, $40,000, and we're more at, $20,000, $25,000 before you start paying. I think there's a lot of value in eliminating tuition. I don't, at least for some programs, I don't see a principled reason why we charge tuition for grades 13 and 14 when we don't for grades 11 and 12. When we made high school free, that was a big debate. There were a lot of people who thought we ought to charge tuition at high school. And we decided not to. And our educational attainment, dominated the world. You were, at one point 3 times more likely to have a diploma in the US than you were in Europe. And that was a big factor in our prosperity over the last 100 years. So, I don't think that means every program, professional school, whatever needs to be free. But I think providing those subsidies in a way that's seamless, that sends a clear signal to people that we expect them to go to college, we're willing to invest alongside of them, and avoids all the complexity and messiness of even the new FAFSA and all the other student aid systems. And, we used to do that. We had that in California for a while. It worked pretty well.
So I'm going to ask James one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor to hear your questions. We have a microphone that's going to be carried around. So please raise your hand, but think about that in advance. James, the final question I have for you before we open it up is that, again, let's look ahead. I think that the debate in the past has sometimes devolved back to, Republicans pushing pretty aggressive reform and Democrats opposing that, but by way of defending the status quo. And whether or not one thinks the status quo was something that was to be defended or not to be defended, in the Department of Education especially, but in many other parts of the government, that's really not an option anymore, or at least it's not the default option. And so the next administration, whether it's Republican or Democrat, is going to have a question of how do we rebuild the Department of Education, taking into account all the programmatic and process issues that we've talked about. So, without knowing what the policy priorities of that administration are, or who the next secretary or undersecretary would be, what would you tell them in terms of the priorities on how to, let's stipulate that they're going to build something back. How should they do that? What should they do? And how is it different than what we had before?
Yeah. Well, I think the first and most important thing is to get your arms around the place immediately. And, typically some Senate confirmed officials are not in place for a year or a year and a half into the 4-year term. And their staff gets hired after that. That's not going to work when you have a department that's literally, was under-resourced before and struggling before and is now half the size. And I wouldn't expect people to give the new team any credit or any grace and say, like, we understand things aren't going to work for a while because of what happened. So, there needs to be a clear game plan to get people in place who can operate the department day to day. And that may mean contractors. It may mean using personnel authorities. There needs to be a clear game plan right away. And then, I think you're right that we need to rebuild these programs. And the answer is probably not just to tape together what we had before, but we need to think carefully about what worked and where we can do better. And, for example, we were talking some about relatively low student outcomes across the system. It is unusual for progressives to be advocating for, what's essentially a voucher system with no guardrails and expect that to get good results. We haven't had good results with that in other areas of social policy. And a lot of the problems we have in the higher education system is actually not confined to an individual student or even an individual campus. Like the problems we have are a student graduates from high school with great grades only to show up on campus and find they need 2 semesters of developmental education in math. Or they complete their community college degree and they take it to the 4-year university across the street and their credits don't transfer in major, so they have 3 more years to go instead of 2 more years to go. And none of those institutions are well connected to employers' needs. They don't even speak the same vocabulary when they say, here's what our graduates can do, and employers are saying, well, here's what we need. There's no real communication there at all. So, I think when we are thinking about what kind of federal policies will build the higher education system we want, we need to think more about the gaps in our current systems and where individual institutions meet each other, because that's how students experience it, and that's where they run into many of their problems.
Great. Well, let's take some questions. I would like to take the first question from an undergraduate student, if they would like to volunteer. You used to be a student, fair enough. Fair enough. If there are no undergraduate students, we can go with a graduate student, sure. If you just give us tell us your name and who you are and ask your question.
Sure, yes. My name's Jack. I'm a student in the Master of Public Affairs program here. And I'm really interested in sort of understanding how the for-profit university system will operate now, because I don't know if this is true, but maybe they're seeing an opportunity to prey on more students now that the Department of Education doesn't have enforcement mechanisms to regulate those. Can you speak on that?
Yeah. So, for-profit colleges and universities, another word for them might be federal colleges, because they receive student aid. They typically don't get funding from states, very little oversight from states. Particularly 15 or 20 years ago, there was a huge boom in enrollment on online for-profit universities in particular. So University of Phoenix had 450,000 students alone, and there were others, topping 100,000. And, their performance varied, but in many cases, they were making loans to students. I know you know this, but they were making loans to students that they couldn't afford. And we found a lot of evidence of high pressure, deceptive recruiting tactics. So the Obama administration and the Biden administration, there were 3 main things we did. First is we established the gainful employment rule, which set a minimum outcomes for employment and debt. We developed something called borrower defense, which was relief for borrowers who had loans connected to illegal conduct at colleges and universities. They could get their loans forgiven, and also it was a way to hold colleges accountable and deter them. And then we staffed up our investigations unit. And one challenge we had was, these are national enterprises. They're nested in complex corporate structures, and our creditors didn't understand them. Our regular oversight didn't understand them. So we needed more expertise. Now, 2 of those things have been rolled back. The gainful employment rule is unclear, but it seems possible that they will roll it back. And I think that does raise concerns about whether there will be low quality for-profit colleges coming back, for sure. From the people I talk to, like the private equity people do not want to get back in this business. And they fueled, some of the problems. And that's because they don't want to invest in the business if they're concerned that another Democratic administration will come along. It is a concern. I'm worried there won't be enough people keeping their eyes on them. I don't think it will get back to where it was, but it's definitely, an issue to be concerned about if you care about students and consumer protections. Yeah.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I have a question about this idea of like the return on investment from our investment into universities, and your point that in the private sector, the push is on the minimum viable product before iteration and then improvement. So the question is like, is the problem that we have failed to communicate how valuable academic research is in terms of influencing the products that we have in society, whether that's like the iPhone or drugs or medicine or whatever? Or is it that we've actually fallen behind the kind of innovation and research that the private sector can do because of the way that they structure creating products?
I think it is more the former. I mean, the basic research that's the foundation for private sector innovation still comes from universities. And Michael Crow at Arizona State did this incredible thing about the iPhone and how all the different components of the iPhone was downstream of government investments in university research. That said, I hesitate to say it's just a communications problem. My experience is people want to think it's as easy as writing a really great op-ed, but when people are mad, there's usually some truth to their perspectives. And I think we do need to be a little more humble and listen to the people that are angry about us and see if there are valid seeds of criticism.
Thanks.
That's it.
Thank you very much. Jim Head, Planetary Geosciences here at Brown. It seems to me we're dancing around a really most fundamental issue in this whole question. Great discussion, but I don't think it's about educational reform. The Trump administration and the 2025 project are engaged in a fundamental attack on science and education. That's basically it, okay? And indeed, what they're doing is they're killing it off. It's not a question of reform, in my view. You can contradict me, please. I hope you do. But in fact, it is a fundamental fight to the death, okay? Because they don't want educated voters, they want sheep, and they don't want people who are telling them that their policies about global climate change or using oil, et cetera, or other reasons are wrong. And that I'd like your comments on that. Sorry.
Oh, did you not use the mic? The question, I don't know how to summarize your question.
Right. The question is about whether, to what extent are the Trump administration policies against higher education something that is spurred by a higher education specific issue, or whether it is part of a more general fight against science and information, and they don't like educated voters.
I don't think the Trump administration is a unitary actor, so it's a little bit hard to think about like what does the Trump administration want. It gets to be a little bit epistemological. I think the president enjoys exerting the authority that he has or that he claims to have. And when leaders of the wealthiest or most prestigious institutions in our country, acknowledge that they depend upon his good favor, I think that's a good day for him. I think there are others in the conservative movement who see colleges and universities as, upholding a progressive worldview and want to change that for sure. They talk about, degrading the resources, driving down enrollment. I think there are some who might like to have a Fox News university. They might like to have a university that they feel serves their perspectives completely and embraces their worldview. I don't think that's possible. I think that is too different from the core of what a university is. I don't think it's possible to do that and have, evidence-based conversations and a commitment to free inquiry and everything else. But, I'm not sure they'll be satisfied with any version of a university that we would recognize.
Please, down in front.
Hi, my name is Aaron, and I'm a student of the MPA program. I'm an international student, and that's why I'm interested in the perspective you have on US universities or Ivy League universities in terms of like global education, because there's a lot of students that come here. There's also university students from Brown that go abroad. And I would just like to know, especially now with what's happening, where it might change a little bit, like who can come and so on, what your perspective is on that. And then also maybe if you have heard of any plans of universities to form new alliances and kind of build new partnerships, because especially in Europe, where I was educated in undergrad, we have like a lot of initiatives where universities form alliances, and student mobility is, at least from what I've seen here in the US, much more common in Europe. And I was just interested if you have seen any initiatives or have a feeling for where this is all headed.
By alliances, you mean like partnerships to improve transfer, or?
Yeah. All sides of all different types of transfer. I went to a university that was an alliance, and they thought of the alliance as an intra-university environment where knowledge could float freely across borders, people could float freely, and so on.
I think the decline in enrollment from international students that seems likely is really unfortunate. I think international students bring a lot to our campuses and do a lot to enrich the education that American students get. It's also an export, right, John? You're the economist, which I thought we wanted more of. The question about transfer, I do think there is a lot more work being done on transfer recently. And, we built community colleges. Truman Report was during the Truman administration. The original idea was you were going to start at community college, do your first 2 years, then transfer and earn a 4-year degree. So community colleges over time have also added a bunch of trade and career programs. But the original idea was academic. And it's almost as if no one ever told the 4 years that. The student surveys say 85% of community college students want a 4-year degree someday, and 17% get it. So there's a real problem in that handoff between community colleges and 4 years. I think the good news is that 4 years seem to have gotten the memo on that. And I think it is some strong fundamentals. You have declining numbers of high school students, fewer high school graduates every year for the foreseeable future. You have an interest in pipelines of diverse students. And fundamentally, they can do the work. I mean, the data show that transfer students do as well in upper division classes as native students do. So my hope is that people will take this problem more seriously. And, there are examples of bilateral transfer programs at work. There are statewide. There are some exciting companies that use AI to demonstrate that the community college curriculum meets the competencies specified by the 4-year faculty. So there's a lot of interesting things going on.
Let me actually pick up on something that you said just before we go to the next question, which is a dimension of this that we didn't really talk about. The very large increase in the share of students at, let's say, public 4-year, especially the more flagship or more selective 4-year schools that are coming from international backgrounds. And this is something that varies enormously across universities. Even if you look at like the 50 state flagship public schools, varies from I think 50% down to essentially zero. There are many different angles to view this from, right? We're attracting international students, presumably because there's a product here that people are very excited about. These are students who may end up staying and working in the U.S. So it's kind of an immigration dimension to this. But for sure, it was a very large especially on those campuses that had a larger share, a very large change in the experience of what it was like to be on these campuses. Do you have a sense that we saw in the public perception of higher ed some of the same patterns that we saw more generally, where kind of as the share of foreign-born individuals in the population went up, there kind of started to be kind of higher and higher kind of anti-immigrant feelings? Or do you think that has not, the students in selective higher ed is not a case where you've seen this type of reaction? Just kind of thinking about, how we got to where we are in terms of the public perception of higher ed.
I have not really seen evidence that it's well understood. There are individual institutions now where even just in the last few years, there's been very significant growth in the number of international students. And, of course, they're popular with college administrators because they tend to pay full tuition. So there's higher revenue per student. I haven't seen a political backlash. I do think there's value in having healthy representation of international students on campus. I also would like to see these institutions admitting more American students. So, I think those are both worthy goals.
Please.
My name is Joe Rabant, and I'm on the faculty of the medical school. I wonder if, just to piggyback on the comment from the gentleman who's educated in Europe, if you might see or comment on this topic through what you might call study abroad, and how a huge percentage of medical students have worked abroad before they come to medical school, how it's incredibly popular for American students to study abroad, and see that as it relates to inter-school alliances throughout the world.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that there has been growth in study abroad. I think it's a very positive experience for students who can do it. I know it was for me. I think we should, there's new programs now around study abroad at home. I actually think that's worth considering too. We have a huge country that actually is quite diverse, and I don't think we understand ourselves as well as we could. I think any effort that colleges and universities make to align their standards and expectations with other institutions is helpful. We need more mobility among institutions. So if study abroad is a route to that, I think that's great.
We have a hand out front here, and then it'll go in the back over there.
Hi, I've been living in the UK the past few years, and I'm a retired professor. And I went back and did a master's degree in music at Liverpool. Uh-huh. And so I think I have a pretty good look what those universities are like. And the Russell Group is Oxford, Cambridge, Liverpool. It's top notch, right? Their tuition is £9,000 a year. So how does America, how can we compare ourselves to a country where the top universities are £9,000 a year?
Yeah.
The costs in America don't make sense. England's a tiny country with a small tax base.
I agree with you. I think we need much more investment in our colleges and universities. I think that we have allowed people to think about college as an investment that our students are making in themselves. And we have shortchanged the stake we all have in having more educated population. And that is a major problem. We need to articulate the reasons why education is important for all of us as a society to have more educational attainment. The one point I might, just sort of qualify a little bit is, our elite institutions are still worth it. They are very expensive. A lot of people want to come to Ivy Plus institutions, and they propel people to, the upper rungs of our society. You don't see a lot of people dropping out of Brown because they can't afford it. That's very common at community colleges or at public universities. So I guess the tweak I would make is, I think we should be thinking not about sticker price, but at the value you get for enrolling in college. And I think a lot of the problem is actually at places that might have lower tuitions, but where students are unlikely to graduate.
So we had a question in the back there, and I was actually in England on my own kind of study abroad when they first started raising the fees. And what was fascinating in that debate was that, as you noted, the level of tuition was an order of magnitude, like literally 10 times lower than we were. And yet the exact same political debate ensued. It was like, oh my God, how could you possibly think about charging, 4,000 pounds in tuition? I mean, it's like completely unreasonable. And what you're telling me, the government is going to have a list of people's incomes down the line, and we're going to make their repayments of loans conditional on that? I mean, this is just like a violation of, basic privacy. I mean, it was fascinating just to, again, you can think whatever you want about whether that's a good idea or that's a bad idea, whether you like the British system before, after, whether you like our system. But the fundamental reference dependence in the politics really, I remember it really standing out to me, as this was happening. I'd been overseas for like 2 months, and it was, my initial reaction was like, oh my God, like I cannot believe that you are, this is where the line of the debate is.
That's interesting.
Please, in the back.
Okay, my question is also related to the financial aspect of things. And you're talking about financial aid and student aid a lot as like a good thing, which I think it is accepted as. But do you think maybe that like an increase in investing in colleges and student aid might allow colleges to like increase their spending to maybe like unsustainable levels, something like that?
So that's, a concern a lot of people have. I think it is complicated because our system of higher education is so complex. As a general rule, there is not a lot of evidence that increases in student aid has led to higher tuitions over time. There are some exceptions to that. Graduate programs, students can borrow up to the full cost of tuition fees, room and board. And there have been at least some papers that find that has contributed to higher tuitions there. Congress has actually just reformed that program. So good news, I guess, from that perspective, at least. For-profit colleges often price very closely tied to the available student aid. But at a place like Brown, the maximum Pell Grant is about $7,000. If we, increase that to $8,000, it still would be, so far away from Brown's tuition that it doesn't really have an impact in, the financial model that they have. So mostly it has not been a problem, with some exceptions in our very complicated system.
Let me ask a question that kind of comes up around this. So, right, one issue which you asked about is whether aid increases flow into tuition changes, where we're not actually really changing what the sticker price is. I think another way in which this question comes out is when we, through either more loans or whatever other investment, if we put more money into the systems, to what extent is it spent on, say, instructional expenditures or stuff that seems very connected with the educational mission, or to what extent is it spent on a variety of other things that universities do? And, you can kind of, depending on what you like and what you don't like, you can kind of pick your favorite university spending bogeyman. It can be the large football stadium. It can be lots of administrators. It can be, the lazy river at the student center. It can be the fancy cafeteria, whatever. fundamentally, there's a difference between some proposals which have tried to think about how can we incentivize or regulate the way colleges are spending their resources. That's kind of an input-based system. Much of the way you have talked about this from a policy perspective is really more outcome-based, right? We're interested in whether a college is leading to students who, after they've attended, have too much debt relative to their income or don't see an increase in income or something like that. And what's fascinating is that when we think about the way we often regulate K through 12, it's exactly the opposite, right? People have been very hesitant to put on outcome-based measures. We've really rolled back a lot of the No Child Left Behind provisions that were more outcome-based, and instead there's been kind of much more focus on the input-based stuff. So how do you think about that from, let's stipulate that we're interested in student success, we're interested in quality, we're interested in value. I mean, two very different ways of approaching it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in your question, and our higher education system is so diverse. So, I worked for Larry Summers, and I eventually learned that when I was talking about policy with him, I had to say, this is not like Harvard because X, but now let's get to the question. So, this is not like Brown, but, half of students almost go to community colleges where educational expenditures are on par or lower than high school.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, Brown and other elite schools spend an enormous amount on instructional expenditure.
That's right. And, another quarter go to public universities, which, some of them are gold-plated flagships, but a lot of them are regional universities that serve populations that look a lot like the community college population. And, historically Black colleges and universities, very thinly funded. So, there are a lot of these places where I suspect if they had more resources, they would provide more student support, they would attract more research dollars, and that would enhance the educational experience. So, I think it is, that's one of the reasons why I think like cost, you have to be a little bit careful when you think about cost. I think you might be better off spending more money on community colleges if they had higher cost. And, you also have to, think differently about these incentives. I mean, at Brown, how many students get Pell Grants? 20%?
I think it's more like 15, 16 these days, actually.
So, Pell Grants is not a major factor in driving Brown's tuition policy. At a for-profit college, they may get 90% of their revenue from student aid. And so it really drives the tuition that they set. Across the board, I think most Pell dollars do go to reducing the costs that students pay. I think that's a good thing. We have very strong evidence over many years that the cost of college is a very important factor in whether students enroll and whether they complete. But I also think our colleges in many cases would be better off spending a little bit more.
Please.
Gentlemen, a cost is not an abstract idea or concept, right? I'll give you an example. I graduated from medical school in 1982. The tuition was $7,000. And paying off my student loan within a year. So today, I know the cost of a hamburger in McDonald's, right? It's very high, but still affordable. So what happened to the high cost of higher education? What happened to this country, right?
You want to do the
high cost education is the root cause of problem of a student loan repayment, right? So why could we address that?
You can do, I don't really believe it. Why don't you do it? Yeah.
So, right, I think there's two separate issues that are going on here. There's a set of issues that are specific to trying to spend more money in the higher education sector, which I will leave to James. There's also an issue which is known broadly as Baumol's cost disease. And the general idea to it is that productivity in some jobs, especially jobs that are making things and exporting them or doing services for, and exporting services or selling services, the productivity in those jobs goes up a lot over time, and pay generally tracks the increases in productivity. So what you can get paid to be a computer programmer is a lot higher now than it was in 1982. Even though what a college professor or a nurse is doing now is not that different than it was in 1982, we have to be able to pay them more to convince them to be college professors and teachers and nurses when there are these other jobs that have wages that are going up over time. And so, the classic example that Bill Ballmer used is a haircut, right? Haircut now is kind of the same as it was in 1982, but the cost of a haircut has gone up by a factor of 20. It's actually gone up a lot faster than inflation because you have to pay someone to want to be a barber. And so I think that is we can disagree on the share of this, but I do think that that's a kind of a factor in a lot of these service-oriented professions and the costs, which I think it's a very large share of what we think of kind of government services, a lot of healthcare, it's a lot of education.
Yes. I mean, it's clearly true that social services are growing as a share of GDP, and there's a reason why it seems more expensive and harder for governments to provide these services year after year. I kind of think, though, it is on the demand side. I mean, the places that have huge costs serve a relatively small percentage of students, and people want to go there more than ever. So there is plenty of demand to go to institutions that charge $60,000 a year or $100,000 a year. I guess Vanderbilt is breaking, including room and board. And so I think fundamentally that's why people think it's worth it.
We have a question here.
Oh, that's my nephew. I'm in trouble.
So my name is Thomas. I'm a senior at Brown, so I'm about to be a recent college graduate. And obviously these things are cyclical, but recent college graduates are facing a very tough labor market, an inflation or unemployment rate that is a lot higher than average. And then of those who do have a job, an increasing amount of people have a job that doesn't require a bachelor's degree. And whether that's an economic slowdown or AI, I don't know, what the reasoning is. Do you see an evolution in us perceiving colleges as the primary driver of economic mobility?
Yeah, great question.
Totally unbiased opinion.
Maybe I'm biased, but I thought that was...
I'll tell you it's a great question. But you were my student, so maybe that doesn't count either.
There's been a lot of debate this year about what's happening in the labor market. And there have been some suggestion that there has been less demand for entry-level employees in jobs that are exposed to AI. I think it's a little early to say for sure. So, if I had to guess, I would look back and say, yeah, we saw the first signs in 2025, but it's entirely possible that there's something else going on. We don't really know yet. In terms of where we're going, there's been so much interest in career post-secondary programs. And I think on the right, they see them as less ideological. And on the left, people are worried about racial disparities in college attainment, and they're worried about student debt. So there's just like a lot more interest in sort of the shorter term career focused programs. And maybe some people think that those are safer from AI because they involve more manipulation of the physical world. I kind of suspect that we are going to come back to the 4-year degree. And the things that liberal arts colleges have been telling us all along that they teach, like learning how to learn and critical thinking and collaboration. And all of those things will be the things that people really need in order to thrive alongside AI, I suspect. But the challenge for us as educators is going to be, not having those happen as a magical byproduct while we are teaching you engineering content, but how can we design our educational programs to intentionally teach those things? And so I think there's actually quite a bit of work for us to do to be clearer about what we mean And can we assess it so that we can say to an employer, yes, this person has a growth mindset of 4 or whatever. And, can we intentionally teach it?
I was just going to say, I think that the data are, the return to skill is higher than it's ever been before. And of course, what do skills mean? That can differ. There was a lot of interest in kind of coding skill. I'm guessing, that's a skill that's going to get easier for people without specialized expertise to do going forward. But, these things kind of rise and fall. Even if you look in some of, you take kind of the anti-higher ed, right? These are all actually like quite skilled trades positions where it's not like you kind of roll out of high school graduation and you're making an enormous amount the next day. These are skills that are crafted over long periods of time. I'm guessing that higher education institutions are going to be the place where people acquire those skills for a long time, even if the exact mix of the skills is going to change. We'll take our final question over here.
Hi, Mark Dunkelman. I'm a fellow here. In your initial conversation about your frustrations, both with the Trump administration and the way that they've sort of unilaterally taken a jackhammer to the department, there's a frustration about too much executive power. And then earlier in the conversation, you were talking about FAFSA and the frustrations you had while you were in the department not being able to get things done, which seems like a deficit of executive authority. How would you square those two critiques into something where we've got sort of a system that works, but that it can't be abused? Is there some sort of model you have in mind that we could apply more generally, even beyond the world of education? But the sort of I'm hearing in your critique sort of a ambiguity. It's whether there should be more power in the people who are in charge of things or less. And I'm just not sure where we end up.
I mean, that's a great insight.
Someone should write a book about that in the context of like utilities and power.
Is that what you have done?
Yes. Selling to bookstore near you for $25.99.
I think it is too. I do think it is too hard to get things done within the government, and it has eroded our credibility that we are unable to deliver the benefits that we have promised people for a variety of reasons. I don't. I wouldn't conflate that with using authority that you don't possess to punish your ideological enemies. And, I think the hard task for all of us is going to be thinking about what kind of regime we want to put back in place. And, after Watergate, there were a set of reforms intended to address the abuses and overreaches of the Nixon administration. A lot of those have been trampled upon now. And, I think we do need to think about what types of safeguards and what types of checks and balances we need to have on executive authority. And I do have, a new appreciation for institutional structures that make the government less effective. There may have been some wisdom in the framers kind of kneecapping the executive branch a little bit. And, how do we balance that? I'm not sure, but, I do think when you want to create a new FAFSA, if you want to, just as you do in any other management project, you want to empower someone to make the decisions and hold them accountable when it doesn't work. And, at Crux, the problem was we had lots of people who wanted to make decisions, and the person actually doing the work was not able to define the scope of the project. So hopefully there is some way to square that circle.
That's a good place to end. Please thank me for joining me and thanking James.